I'm changing everything, oh, everything around me. The world is a bad place, a bad place, a terrible place to live. Oh, but I don't wanna die.
What particularly unsettled you on occasions?
With my mother or when I did the tour?
With your mother?
Well, the worst example of all was that sense of what happens to them when you leave them. Are they in good care? And I remember leaving my mother one day and she seemed absolutely perfectly fine. She'd had a good day. And I went back 2 days later and she was lying in bed in somebody else's clothes. And she'd been made up to look like Bette Davis in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Now, voluntarily they said she'd allow this makeup person to come in and do that to her. But, you know, it smacked of a kind of lack of dignity, actually, of carelessness. Nobody was being deliberately cruel, but it was disturbing in the sense I wondered what else happens then when I'm not there. And that was the most profoundly disturbing thing of all. It was also, too, it was that business about sitting around waiting to die, basically. There wasn't much that was done to stimulate them. And I saw on this tour a year later the possibilities. I thought that all care homes might be like that in a sense, which it wasn't a bad care home. It wasn't cruel or anything like that. It was careless. And I thought maybe that's what it was all about. And I went to, certainly in my year, to care homes like that. But I also went to some where just with imagination, not money, just imagination and going that extra yard, people had made the quality of life, not quality of care for people, the quality of life for older people, much, much better. I went down to one place near Brighton where they just opened up this rummage room where they put in all kinds of bric-a-brac, stuff to people could fondle and touch and remember. And it stimulated conversation, it stimulated their minds. There was a music room where they could go. My mother responded to music, you see, and that was something that didn't happen in the care home. It happened by chance when I took her out in the car and put a record on. So those things were positive and showed what could be done.
I wanted to ask you about that story. I think you played us some Frank Sinatra.
I did. My slavish devotion to Frank Sinatra is entirely due to my mother, who played all the records to me when I was a kid. And so I grew up with the Great American Songbook. And one day, and she was in a terrible... I couldn't speak to her. She thought I was somebody else. I'd kind of lost patience in a sense and thought, oh, I'll get her out in the car. At least we can drive around the countryside and something might happen then. And we got in the car and away we went, and I put this Frank Sinatra, and she sang every single song, word perfect. The lyrics, it had touched some part of her mind, which is unaffected by the dementia, and she was happy. It made her happy, it made her feel more relaxed, and her face changed. And I thought, well, if that can be done, a simple thing like that, what are we missing here?
When you, going back to the way she was being cared for, when you raised any of the concerns that you've just outlined to those who were doing the caring, what tended to be the reaction?
Well, you tended to get the emollient reaction to it. You know, well, I'm so sorry it happened. It won't happen again. You had found pills underneath her bed. She wasn't taking them and that sort of thing. But then you have as much as you object to what's happening, you have a certain sympathy for people in that situation because you keep asking yourself, maybe foolishly, would I do this job? No, I damn well wouldn't do this job. You know, and you look around for ways out of it other than just the ways of shouting at somebody or complaining. And there aren't any. It seemed to me another reason why maybe this Dignity in Care campaign that we went about might be a more positive way of trying to change things, because we're trying to change attitudes of people who are involved in the industry. And the proudest thing of all is that when we started 12 months ago, we had 1,000 people signed up to making a change in attitude, and now we've got 12,500 people. So there is within the industry itself, there's a recognition that things need to change among the staff, different attitudes, and there is a groundswell certainly which I hope successive governments might actually continue.
Well, there's a lot to talk about that certainly you've written in the report, lots that I know people want to share with you by way of their experiences. 03700 100 444 is the number to call. Let's go first on the phones to Derek Fisher in Gloucestershire. Derek, good afternoon. What's your experience of the care system?
My experience has been that we have had some relations in care homes, and some good and not so good, but generally what Michael's been talking of there, of perhaps loneliness, of being stuck in a corner. And we as a family, when my wife started having Parkinson's, said if anything we can do, we will try and avoid my wife going into a care home, because in the best will in the world, there's no place like home. Now, it's very simple to say that, because obviously, how can you replicate a care home in your own home? we think we've done that pretty well.
Go on, tell us how.
We employ our own carers. Therefore, these carers are on a one-to-one basis. And it isn't as expensive as you might think, because we haven't got all the overheads of a care home. We are in our own home. Now, we do this roughly that very fortunately we have got family as well around us, and roughly that 2/3 of the care is being done by carers and 1/3 is being done by our family.
And those carers are doing as good a job as they possibly can, as far as you're concerned?
An excellent job, because they are sympathetic to my wife. They're not like these places where you have an agency where they just call in, which would be no good for my wife, because her particular illness is one where she's often had periods of sleep, so she's only awake at certain times. For example, she's only just woken up now to hear this broadcast, and so but other times she might be awake at 6 o'clock in the morning. So it is very much something tailored to her. But what is so marvellous is these carers coming in, and there they are with my wife looking at her art, things that she used to do when she could do those things, and it absolutely wakens her up, and she's back in the land of the living.
It's good to hear. It's good to hear a positive call, Derek. Thank you very much indeed for that. Sue Papworth in West Yorkshire. Sue, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Julian.
Your experiences here.
Well, I've had more than 20 years' experience of having care at home from my early 40s. I'm now 65. I've got no family around to help. There have been some changes in it, but there are still some problems. I chime very much with what Sir Michael said about people don't see you. And as for carers, some are wonderful, some are awful, but you're not allowed to complain. The major problems I've had that have stopped care working are really poor communication. If you try to tell anyone within the system that things are wrong, it seems to be seen as a challenge they've got to defend against. You know, you're trying to play catch, but they're playing tennis. It gets whacked back at you. And that's I've not been able to find a way around that.
Have you heard that, Michael Parkinson, that people, when they do want to raise a perfectly legitimate issue, haven't felt able to?
In the letters I received, that was a dominant theme, Julian, and it's something that needs addressing. I mean, they're fobbed off. People in dire circumstances might just have lost their loved one, get a letter when they're complaining about treatment or whatever it might be, some kind of official document saying in the fullness of time we'll deal with it. What kind of a reaction is that? You know, it is because of the vast bureaucracy often involved in the National Health Service, people get treated as ciphers and not as human beings, and I think that's totally and absolutely wrong. On the system of carers, I mean, your caller now, I found with my mother a vast discrepancy in the standard of carers that came along, and it did seem to me, and here we're in dangerous territory, I know, but the worst ones came, and the majority maybe from the lower end of you might say the educational system, and that what we need to really address here is trying somehow to improve that job, to make it more tantalizing to different kind of people who actually regard it differently, because it's a much more sophisticated job now than it ever was before.
Sue, is that something you would echo?
I very much so. My position is rather different in that the person I'm having to care for is me. I don't have any family to help. And it's very easy for me to be swatted down, because when you are sick, disabled, particularly old, you can be portrayed as awkward, forgetful, gaga, unable to judge. And most people sadly see this sort of cardboard cutout figure of a disabled or an elderly person.
Absolutely.
And when I had this really, really nasty experience 10 years ago with an agency care worker, I was ill in bed in the living room, really not terribly well. She was trundling round upstairs. I could hear her opening cupboard doors and drawers and talking on her mobile phone. Which isn't nice. When she came down, I asked her to leave the house, and she refused. I picked the phone up, telephoned social services, and I had this woman holding me down by the throat and getting the phone off me and shouting, "You're not telling anyone about me." And social services just heard screaming and put the phone down. Now, after this, forgive me, I was told I must have the same agency back, and I refused, and I needed help to get out of bed at the time. It's very hard to say bugger off to your care when you really need it.
It is.
And I've also been told it's your word against theirs. If that's what happened. I was told quite recently that I'd been shouting and swearing at people. As my doctor says, I have been unable to shout for 10 years. I've got a bit of throat damage from the radiotherapy that I had. And I found that communication within the system, if you try to tell anyone, there are so many different departments. I don't know if you know how it works, but there's you have an assessment department within social services. You get a social worker who says what care you need, but he or she can't get it for you. They have to pass the whole package of info along to the brokers department.
Sue, I'm going to say thank you very much for the call,
Yeah.
simply because, as you can appreciate, a lot of other people would like to have their say as well. But this issue of bureaucracy, I know we will come back to it at various points during the next half an hour or so. Shari Val is my colleague in the phoning room upstairs from where I am. Shari, what are you reading?
Julian, we've had an extraordinary response. Many of the emails that have come in, and there are lots of them, are very long and they detail very difficult situations for many people with different experience. Some are extremely moving. Some, like Vivian Haynes, who struggled with a mother, a son, a sister-in-law and a daughter with various different serious care needs, apologises for her long email and suggests there's a bit of getting it off your chest going on here at the moment. And she reflects the emails of a large number of people. They detail frustration, sometimes exhaustion, and sometimes just plain fury. Anne Watson from Cornwall writes, care of the elderly people with dementia in the UK is a shameful national disgrace. Unless they have vigilant friends and relatives and family who are not always kind, the elderly clients have no advocate to defend them from ignorant, insensitive staff. There must be proper training for those working with the elderly. They should be paid and valued more and their status raised to that of the professional, with pride in what they do. We've had one who I won't name, who's a qualified nurse. She says people who are employed within this environment do care about the elderly, but it's usually a demoralising and very tiring job, and most of the people I've worked with do recognise there are problems but are powerless to do anything. She says, I've even witnessed outright abuse against one elderly demented resident, which when I reported it was covered up because they couldn't afford to lose the staff member who'd abused the resident. She was working 4 nights a week and therefore a valued member of staff. There are many, many emails coming in, many with details, intricate details of what's going on.
Just on that, Michael Parkinson, you don't go into the care sector unless you want to care, do you? Because you're not going into it for the money, clearly.
Not the glory, not the privilege of working in the system at all. No, you go into it because you're a caring person, because you want to make a difference, because you want to care for your fellow human beings. They go with the best of motives. And maybe that's what we try to sort of remind people of in this campaign of ours. Think back to why you started this job, why you went in the first place. And maybe then you might be able to re-establish in your own mind what's wrong now with it, and why have you got disenchanted maybe. And as I said, we had a very good responses. I mean, 12,000 people responded, sufficient enough to make me think that the entire thing was worthwhile. But it's a difficult job, and you know, more often than not, I looked around the places that I went to, and what was lacking was leadership. What was lacking in the ones that didn't work was any sense of somebody being on top of the job, of going around and making sure that things were happening. But overall, you have to say that though we can pick and natter away about this, and we should rightly do that, we have to we cannot see this picture of care within our National Health Service and the care system without regarding how we look at old people, generally speaking, in our society. And that's a very, very important point.
Yeah, I do want to get onto that in more detail in the second half of the programme.
Yeah.
We will go some positive examples as well, both from you and from our reporters here, of places where it works fantastically well. But yesterday on the programme we did feature a report by the Patients Association which featured 16 cases of people who had suffered problems with the care offered to their relatives. One of them was Mike Weston. His mother, Betty Weston, was admitted to hospital with a fractured hip following a fall at home, and she then began a 5-day wait for her first operation.
The sad part about this, of course, was that during that period she was actually kept nil by mouth. She couldn't get out to use the toilet facilities because she was immobile and was told to wet the bed. Highly embarrassing for an 85-year-old independent woman. I visited her one particular day and sat by the side of her bed, and she had cause to use the toilet while I was there and was in floods of tears, and I'm afraid I was exactly the same. There's no dignity for someone of 85-year-old to be having to be doing that.
And when you raised that with the nurses, as you no doubt did, what was the reaction?
The reaction, well, first of all, in that particular instance, well, we'll deal with it when we have a moment. There didn't seem to be any urgency to that situation. Before this occurred, it did not cross my mind, but whilst it was happening, I did some checking and was told that obviously the key timing for hip operations is 24 to 48 hours, because thereafter they have a better chance of recovery. If it goes past that time, then there's difficulty to get themselves back into a normal existence. And so obviously I was greatly concerned by that.
Eventually, as you say, she did have the replacement hip. What happened then?
Well, the first operation was after the 5 days, and unfortunately that didn't happen. The ball joint came out again, so they had to put her down for a revision, and that took a further 3 days before they got round to doing that. And at that point it was decided that they would move her to an orthopaedic hospital some 20 miles away, where I was told that there was a greater option in terms of what they could do, but that took a further 2 days. So all in all, 10 days after that she had fallen, they actually carried out a successful operation. But at 85, I'm afraid she just was too weak to see that out. I saw her the day after the operation, and within 12 hours she died.
Obviously, straight after that, you're dealing with the grief. The family is dealing with the grief
Absolutely.
of losing her. Over some months, as you begin to reflect on what happened in the run-up to her death, what do you pick out now as being things that you are most concerned about?
I think I was concerned about the fact, obviously the fact that they didn't operate soon enough on her. But I also feel that the whole dignity, that this is an 85-year-old woman who had born in 1922, had seen the NHS come into being, and believed that this was one of the best things that had ever occurred, and expected that when she needed it, that they would be there for her, that she'd be treated with the dignity and respect that she deserved. That really wasn't the case. It just generally seemed to be that everyone was far too busy, everyone didn't really want to listen, and she was 85-year-old, wasn't she? We have an ageing population. We need to take care of them.
That was Mike Weston. And Michael Parkinson, that chimes with the idea that in some of the worst cases, people are admitted to hospital or a home, and those caring for them seem to forget that they ever had a past.
Well, that's true, and of course that past is part of building the National Health Service. It belongs to them. It was their generation that thought of it and established it and fought for it. And the treatment of them is another sort of disgraceful. That's an appalling story we've just heard. It reminded me, we got a letter from a woman who said that her mother was taken into hospital, and she went to visit her. She found her naked, lying in bed in a side room, in full view of everybody, in her own urine. I mean, what is going on here? It's desperate, it really is.
I want to hear from one other voice along similar lines, because another of the people featured in the Patients Association report was Marion Smith. Her husband, Colin, was confirmed as having lung cancer in April 2008. He was having chemotherapy and was finding it difficult to swallow. He was admitted to hospital suffering from dehydration.
He was taken in about 3:30 in the afternoon. He was assessed by the doctor. He was put on a drip. Then about an hour after that, he wanted to go to the toilet. So a nurse came in and switched off the drip. Now, he was suffering from dehydration, so needed to be on that drip pretty soon afterwards. So once he'd been to the toilet, I then went out to the nurse. The nursing station was directly outside his room, and I asked, could the drip be switched on? My request went on until about midnight, being ignored.
When you say ignored, Marianne, obviously they heard what you said.
Yes, but they just didn't do it.
They just didn't act upon what you
They
said.
didn't do it. I telephoned my sister, who's a barrister. I didn't think I should have to go that far to ask her to help me. And I said, can you please contact someone in the hospital and ask them to do this for me? And I didn't think I needed to do that.
Tell us about some other things, because I know, for example, your husband fell out of bed on two occasions when he was there.
Yes, he fell out of bed twice, cut his head twice. There was blood on his head, blood on the pillow, blood on the floor. And it was just appalling. When I asked them why couldn't they put the guardrails up on the bed, they said he might climb over them. I said, he's in no fit state to climb over them. He's ill. Surely it's safer to have the guardrails up than him to fall out of bed. And one of the nurses said, "Oh yes, I heard the big thump on the floor and I wondered what it was." It's supposed to be a caring profession, but they failed miserably. And to me, that isn't good enough. I trusted them to look after someone that I loved, and they failed. They failed.
You've had time to reflect on this.
Yes.
How do you feel about the way he was looked after and treated now, looking back over just over a year?
I think if they treated an animal in the same way as they treated my husband, there would be an outcry. When they treat humans like it seems to be ignored. I'm not saying by everybody, but the people that should care for them don't care for them. And there should be accountabilities. There should be more accountabilities for staff that fail their duty of care of their patients.
Marion Smith talking about her husband, Colin. Back to the phones. Andrew Robertson is in Chichester. Andrew, good afternoon.
Yes, hello, Julian.
Your mother's in a care home, I believe.
She is in a care home. I think we're all in danger of treading on the eggshells of political correctness here. I mean, we're constantly told we're a rich nation, and yet we expect to care for our elderly people, and these are the people that are supposed to have created the wealth, by paying little more than the minimum wage to their carers. And the system will never, ever work until we recognise that the people looking after our old folk do a very difficult and responsible job. And they pay little more than kitchen scullions. I mean, my mother's in an excellent, gleaming new home, but even that is constantly struggling to find good, compassionate, and understanding staff that can not only get someone out of bed and help them to the loo, but that can interact with them in some way. And until there's a seed change of attitude, it ain't going to get any better.
It's not a role we value sufficiently, is your view?
It is not.
No.
And even when training is undertaken and junior staff maybe obtain an NVQ, then that only commands a few pence more per hour. It's just this silent majority. It's these elderly people that no one is listening to. And when Sir Michael said it's when he walked out of the room and left his mother, and I do that, and as I leave, I just wonder what is going to happen. My mother luckily has a telephone by her bed, but even then, that is a worry, because she'll sometimes start calling me instead of calling the carers, or she'll call me when no carers arrive, and when a carer does arrive and she's talking to me on the telephone, there's then a language problem with her and the carer, and it's just a constant worry that I was watching Fiona Phillips on television.
Yes, I saw some of that programme last night.
And I think she was absolutely amazing. I went through exactly what she went through, looking after my mother together with my sister, and we thought, and we kept her in her own home for as long as we possibly could. And we thought, right, when she has to go into a care home, at least to some extent, the burden will be removed from us. But it hasn't, and we worry every bit as much now
Andrew,
as we did then.
Thank you very much for contacting the programme. It's nearly 12:30. You're listening to Call You and Yours on BBC Radio 4 with me, Julian Warwick. Still to come, some genuinely inspiring examples of good care as we continue to talk to the National Dignity Ambassador, Sir Michael Parkinson. And what of the wider point that lies behind all of this? We've touched upon it already. The need for us as a society to change our attitudes to older people. 03700 100 444 is the number to call, costing you the same as calls to 01 or 02 numbers, or you can email via bbc.co.uk/radio4/you and yours. Before more of your thoughts, here's Martha with news of today's World at 1 in half an hour. Martha.
Julian, is it right to ban radical Islamist groups? Today, the government has said it's prescribing Islam for UK, the group which wanted to march through the streets of Wootton Bassett. We'll get Muslim reaction to that decision and also hope to speak to a Home Office Minister. Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's Director of Communications, has been giving evidence to the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War. It's been suggested that Tony Blair came to accept the idea of regime change in Iraq when he met President Bush at his ranch in Crawford in Texas. But Campbell told the inquiry that wasn't true.